What happened to global warming?
Chicago died. So bye-bye, Lori Lightfoot, goodbye. Drove my Tesla to the magma, but the magma was dry. The MAGA boys were making Jussie cry, singing, this will be the day that I lie. This will be the day that I die.
There's nothing intelligent that I can say to you.
Well, maybe you should come out and see what's going on.
This is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. I understand you want to preen. I understand that you think that you...
Mayor, you need to check your attitude. That's what you need to do.
That's the kind of leader Lori Lightfoot has been. Grip the press podium and cuss your alderman out for telling you the truth. Lightfoot conveniently did not allow protest on the block where she lives. Again, rules for thee, but not for me. On her 2-year anniversary as mayor, Lightfoot declared she would only choose reporters of color for interviews. Judicial Watch sued Lightfoot on behalf of the Daily Caller, alleging Lightfoot violated journalist Thomas Catenacci's First and 14th Amendment rights. You don't get a better example of discrimination than that.
I was born and raised in, a city that I love with all my heart. You became mayor. The people of Chicago elected you. You shut down our schools. You shut down the churches. You shut down the businesses. You did the one thing that I thought could never happen. As somebody who was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, I never thought in my life that I would ever see the city of Chicago brought down so low as you have managed to bring it down. Shame on you. That is a legacy that you are going to have to carry. Future historians are going to have a hard time understanding how you ever even became mayor of the city of Chicago. I intend to write that book. I intend to make sure that at least there is some possible way for the city of Chicago to move forward. I hope that you realize what damage you have done to the city. I hope that after today's city council meeting, you will pack your suitcase and get the hell out of my city.
Take a look at these age.
When the press secretary was asked whether President Biden owns an EV.
You guys are pushing electric vehicles today. This is a president who always talks about the power of our example. Does he own an electric vehicle?
Presidents of the United States don't do a lot of driving.
He's posted videos where he's revving the engine of his Corvette in Wilmington. He owns cars.
And he also has driven electric vehicles as president.
Does he own one?
I think the president's record on this is clear, Peter.
Does he own one? Well, I think his record on this issue is clear. My guest has explored the questions that have just been posed. Please welcome the editor of CNSnews.com blog, Craig Bannister. Craig, okay, on the whole, are EVs better for the planet than gasoline-powered vehicles?
Well, it takes quite a while before they might be. As you were mentioning, you have to draw. It takes a great amount of CO2 to produce an electric vehicle, so you have to drive one at least 60,000 miles before it begins to offset the carbon produced by a gasoline-powered vehicle.
What about the cost of an EV?
Well, as you know, that's quite high, and the problem here too is that the cost of the battery. If even the slightest amount of damage is done to the battery, more and more insurance companies are just writing the entire vehicle off because the batteries are so hard to diagnose or repair and can cost up to half the price of a $60,000 new electric vehicle.
Craig, let's talk about the battery. Let's talk about the rare earth minerals that go into it. Where do they come from? Who produces it? And what happens to the battery after the end of its shelf life?
Well, it can reportedly take up you might have to mine, I think it was 500,000 pounds of rock and minerals to get what you need to create one electric car, which is, of course, an ecological concern to begin with. And then if you are scrapping more and more of these electric vehicles earlier and earlier, as insurance companies are doing, you end up having these salvage yards filled with electric vehicle batteries, which again is an environmental negative. So the car has to be driven quite a long distance in order to offset the carbon. And if they're being scrapped, totaled earlier and earlier, well, then you lose any green gain, if you will.
You mentioned the CO2 that it takes to make the EV. Talk to us about that.
Well, again, your production of that can consume a great deal of or produce a great deal of CO2, and that alone means that the cars have to be driven an extended period of time before they offset what a car would a gas-powered car would produce. But the big problem right now is these batteries can cost up to $30,000 to replace. And it's extremely hard to diagnose and repair them. And as a matter of fact, with the Tesla Model Y, the battery pack is actually glued into the structure of the vehicle, making it nearly impossible to remove and repair and replace.
Let's talk about our dependence on China for some of the rare earth minerals that go into the EV. Either China produces them, or China controls the mines. For example, in places like Congo, that produces us. Doesn't that make us even more dependent on our number one adversary in the world?
Well, CNSnews.com today, an article, a blog by Craig Millward was explaining how Representative Jason Smith was making that very point, that America has become incredibly dependent on a hostile country in China, a communist regime, to provide us so many of the goods that the nation needs, and that imperils our national security.
Craig, I've driven coast to coast by myself, the northern route, the southern route, and a good old gasoline-powered car. Can you drive coast to coast in an EV?
Well, of course not, unless you, I guess, do extremely careful planning to be able to make it from one charging station to the next. And I believe some reporters have tried that and found the electric vehicle wanting for extended trips. And you have to be very wary of your mileage, what your range is for your electric vehicle. And as I said, you have to map out where the charging stations are, and if you can get there before the car runs out of energy. Though the Biden administration, I believe, has been touting how you can actually power other things with your electric vehicle, which of course is extremely problematic.
The average person who owns an EV here in California, and roughly, Craig, about 2.9% of the vehicles are EVs, are people who are middle class or better, and usually the EV is their secondary car or their tertiary car.
Well, that's an excellent point. There is that a lot of these, a lot of celebrities, a lot of people of extremely high means are the ones touting electric vehicles, and they can afford to do so. Because we're talking about a $60,000 plus vehicle, and how many people of average means can afford that? I mean, if you look back at Nancy Pelosi getting her hair done during the COVID lockdowns, again, the rules don't see the rules as applying to them.
Well, she'd probably use an EV to get to her hairdresser. Okay, Bannister, aside from the psychological comfort that you get from owning an EV, is there anything, in your view, positive about an EV?
Not that I've found so far. As you said, you don't have to shell out as much money for gas. But your insurance premiums, on average, are 27% higher. So that seems to be offsetting any financial benefit that you'd be getting from having an electric vehicle.
Craig Bannister, CNS News. Craig, thank you very much for coming on. God bless.
Thanks a lot.
When we come back, what exactly is the problem with critical race theory, known as CRT?
Hey everyone, Admiral Lagasse. $1 billion to install a network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers. Zach Cipolla is the CEO of Particle, which helps companies secure internet-connected systems like this.
At some point, there's going to be a hack. It's going to be publicized.
Cipolla says hackers could steal personal data or cause chaos on a larger scale by impacting the electric grid.
I think that there's two ways. One is you can be affected on your own personal basis by having your credit card information stolen. There is a physical card reader. Same rules apply as a gas station to an EV charger. Just check it to make sure that it hasn't been tampered with. The second is if the grid is attacked or if the EV charger network is attacked.
These chargers, if they haven't been secured properly, create a weapon that others can use against our countries.
In the United Kingdom, Ken Monroe of Pentest Partners showed Fox News how easy it is to hack into the chargers.
This is one of the worst that we found.
This charger, manufactured by a Chinese company, uses serial numbers.
And it's that connection and that serial number that caused the security vulnerability.
That hackers could use to gain access and create a network of remote-controlled chargers.
It was made by a Chinese organisation that rebadged it into the UK. If you know that serial number, you can compromise this.
And that's a short serial number.
So once we've got a serial, or we can go up or down to different serials, now we can take control of different people's chargers. It's not about turning off one charger, it's about turning them all off and on together.
This could overload the grid, creating blackouts. While both the US and UK are heavily invested in an electric vehicle future, UK right now is leading and regulating the security of chargers.
At this point, the best path forward is to copy what the UK is doing and just do it here.
The challenge now is how to keep a high-voltage electric car climate solution from becoming a new opportunity for a lot of high-tech hackers. In London, Greg Concord, Fox News.
We have recently sanctioned the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library after it hosted a meeting between Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
Tensions are still heating up along the Israel-Gaza border after a number of rocket strikes in the area. The Israeli military says it is targeting sites linked to Palestinian forces. And in Lebanon, missiles have struck some infrastructure and an open field near a Palestinian refugee camp. These attacks are in response to rocket fire into southern Israel from Lebanon Thursday, which damaged multiple buildings and injured at least 2 people.
We were asleep and the rocket fell at 4 o'clock and the building was damaged. It was like the end of times.
Our enemies should not misjudge us. The internal debate in Israel will not prevent us from taking action against them wherever and whenever necessary.
So this conflict began when Israeli police raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque that's in Jerusalem earlier this week. Now, with it being Passover and the holy month of Ramadan, the international community is calling on both sides to de-escalate the fight.
The country is pushing drivers to electric vehicles, but experts warn there could be issues with charging stations. The vulnerabilities some say these power sources come with.
Well, is climate change impacting baseball?
U.S. dollar hegemony. Instead, this is just the latest in a long trend of, I guess, what you can call global de-dollarization. For instance, late last week, the leaders of China and Brazil, they jointly announced a new trade agreement wherein they will buy and sell from each other using their own national currencies and completely circumvent the US dollar. Under this new deal, Brazil and China will carry out trade by directly exchanging the Chinese RMB with Brazilian reals, or vice versa. There will no longer be this intermediary step of converting their local currencies into US dollars, even in the case of oil transactions. Here was a quote from Senator Marco Rubio. He was on Fox News just yesterday talking about this decision by Brazil to ditch the petrodollar and move on over to direct trade with China. Take a listen.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them. As we are sitting here, focused on some of these nuttiness that's going on, people that are basically dedicating their lives in this country to ensuring that it is legal to mutilate children, to do drag shows in schools. They dedicate their lives to this, and we have another superpower that basically wants to become the world's dominant power at our expense, and these people don't want to focus on it.
However, this is not only happening in Brazil, and instead, this ditching of the petrodollar appears to be a growing trend, a trend that's catching on around the world. For instance, at the Russia-China summit that was held last week, Vladimir Putin put out this statement, quote, "We, meaning Russia, are in favor of using the Chinese yuan for settlements between Russia and the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America." For your reference, it's already been the case ever since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine proxy war that China has been purchasing Russian oil using both Russian rubles as well as Chinese yuan. Meanwhile, last week you saw a French company buying 65,000 tons of liquefied natural gas from the United Arab Emirates, and for the first time ever, this French company paid for that gas in Chinese currency. This was the first time that such a thing has happened. France bought liquefied natural gas, it was shipped to them on a tanker from the UAE, and they settled the account on the Shanghai Petroleum and National Gas Exchange using, again, not US dollars, but Chinese yuan. Then you have the case of Saudi Arabia, which has not only been moving closer and closer to China, such as by joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also the government of Saudi Arabia has been expressing more and more willingness to accept local currencies in exchange for their oil. And along that line, just 2 weeks ago, the Saudi government, they agreed to accept Kenyan shillings as a payment for their oil shipments over to Kenya, again, instead of US dollars. Then you had the government of India. They recently came out and they offered the use of their currency, meaning the Indian rupee, as an alternative to the US dollar for international transactions. Here's a short excerpt from Bloomberg reporting on this exact case. Quote, "India will offer its currency as an alternative for trade to countries that are facing a shortage of dollars in the wake of the sharpest tightening in monetary policy by the US Federal Reserve in decades." Then, along that very same line, just last week, you had a meeting over in Indonesia where the finance ministers of almost every nation in Southeast Asia were in attendance. And at the very top of the agenda for this particular gathering, well, they were discussing ways to, quote, "reduce dependence on the US dollar, the euro, the yen, and the British pound from financial transactions and move to settlements in local currencies." The meeting discussed efforts to reduce dependence on major currencies through the local currency transaction scheme. This is an extension of the previous local currency settlement scheme that has already begun to be implemented between ASEAN and its members. ASEAN is, of course, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And so, whether it's the BRICS nations creating their own global currency that's backed by gold, or whether it's these individual nations choosing to transact in their own local currencies, what's becoming clear is that more and more countries are trying to minimize their exposure to the US dollar. However, it is worth mentioning that everything we listed out doesn't necessarily mean that the US dollar will totally collapse in the coming year. The situation on this globe right now is that all countries on the planet are using fiat currencies, currencies that are printed into existence out of thin air by central banks. And all these currencies are collapsing in value in real time. You can see this clearly when you take a look at a graph of these currencies against something more stable, like gold. All fiat currencies are collapsing. It just so happens that the US dollar is the strongest among the collapsing currencies. And furthermore, the US dollar's role in the world economy is still huge, and it remains the most used currency by far. And this reality becomes quite obvious when you take a look at how much the US dollar still dominates the foreign exchange reserves of different countries. What you're looking at on your screen right now is an animated timeline of the assets that are held on reserve by central banks around the world. And the way that you can look at these reserves is as essentially an indication of what these central banks are anticipating for the future. And at the moment, US US dollars still make up about 51% of all foreign exchange reserves, meaning that at least at this very moment, central banks are still anticipating that the US dollar will be needed in order to engage in international trade in the near future. And the US dollar is still far above even the second place currency, which is the euro, at about 20%. However, I believe it was Ernest Hemingway who once famously wrote this, quote, "How did you go bankrupt? Two ways, gradually and then suddenly." And indeed, even though right now the US dollar still dominates foreign reserves, over the past 2 decades, its share of the vault space has been steadily declining, going from 62% in the year 2000 to only 51% today. Meaning that as time has progressed over the past 2 decades, even though right now most transactions are still done in dollars, these central bankers have been anticipating year after year less and less of a need for US dollars in the international marketplace. By the way, I think it's worth mentioning that this is not just a theoretical problem for bankers and financiers. If the US dollar loses its world reserve currency status, or rather, when the US dollar loses its world reserve currency status, you and me are going to suffer quite a lot. And there's many reasons for that. However, one of the most obvious reasons is that about half of the US dollars that are in circulation,
which is the region's only progressive democracy, and only recently was being recognized as a fellow nation state by the Sunni Arabs. All that is now in question because the Biden administration has abandoned the region, and the Xi Jinping regime of China is moving in at full speed using Iran as their proxy, and the Russians are moving in along with the Chinese, partnering with them as well.
And Brandon, you mentioned these negative movements going forward, and what does it mean that China is the one that's brokering this deal, basically?
Well, what it means is that China is exerting its presence on the world stage in previously unknown ways to us. They've always been a power, obviously, in Asia, and they were predominantly a geoeconomic force, but now they've become so wealthy and so integrated with the rest of the world that China is now taking that geoeconomic power and they're translating it into diplomatic power as well as now into military power. And I think your audience needs to be aware that China is preparing to hit Taiwan, whether it's in the next 6 months or 6 years. I think it's going to be sooner than 6 years. They are right now moving hard to hit Taiwan, and I think they need to gain access and greater control and leverage over the Middle East in order to prevent the Americans from having the ability to cut them off from critical oil and natural gas supplies. China gets a lot of their oil and natural gas from the Middle East, from Iran and Saudi Arabia in particular. And what this new deal allows for China to do is to basically bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and then to gain access to both of their energy capabilities and to basically push the Americans out. And so I think this is part of preparing the battlefield, the wider battlefield, for an inevitable invasion of Taiwan and trying to curb any, American counter moves that might be designed to slow down or stop the Chinese invasion. So that's what's going on here.
And Brandon, I want to expand on that. So it sounds like this peace deal isn't just about peace for China. What is China really getting out of this?
Well, and to be clear, we were told when China went in there a few weeks ago that this is going to bring, like you said, peace, love, and happiness. But what do we see? The ink is not even dried on this Chinese-backed deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Iranian-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon is popping off rockets at Israel. And so this is not bringing peace, love, and happiness. What this is doing is creating disorder. This is managed disorder by China to stir the hornet's nest, push the Americans out of the region, and then China comes in and they're going to rebuild the order in their own autocratic image. And so what you're seeing here is the beginnings of that sort of, creative destruction, if you will, by China. And what this is going to do is it's going to not only give China greater control and access to those critical energy flows out of the Middle East, but it's also going to isolate the progressive democracy of Israel. That what China's doing is they're trying also to gain access to high-tech countries. So Saudi Arabia is not just an oil producer, but it's also becoming a high-tech industrial power under the Saudi Vision 2030 plan that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has been pioneering. China wants to get in on that. Huawei's helping to develop Saudi Arabia's Silicon Valley, their equivalent of Silicon Valley. Now they're moving, the Chinese are, and they're saying, look, the Israelis are a high-tech superpower. They do a lot of business with the Americans. The Americans have cut us off from tech development, so we're going to backdoor our way into the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We're going to isolate Israel. We're going to force Israel to come to terms with us in the Middle East, which means they're going to have to turn to China for protection against China's other partner, Iran. And I think that's what this is setting up for, is a big...
What happened to global warming?